Hi, my name's Kevin Hind, and in this short question I want to show you how trade can be beneficial between two countries. In particular, I'm going to argue that we can have benefits for both countries if they specialise in what they're good at and trade between each other. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to offer a short question and then an answer. The question is as follows, that there are two countries, Narnia and Charn, and they can produce two goods, cloth and grain, and they can do that in the following combinations. So what we have here are what we call production possibility frontiers, both in Narnia and in Charn, and we assume that these countries can produce, that will be producing on the production possibility frontiers. That is how they would use their inputs, combine their inputs to produce outputs of cloth and grain. Okay, so that occurred, these are both countries. So for example, if Narnia put all its inputs to making just cloth, it could produce 1,000 units of cloth. You could measure that in millions of yards if you wanted to, but let's just call it units. So it put all its inputs to producing cloth, it would make 1,000 cloth units, but it wouldn't make any grain units because all its inputs, its labour and its capital and its land are tied up in cloth production. It wouldn't produce any grain units. Alternatively, it could put all its inputs into producing grain and produce 500 grain units. Now, it could produce some combination along this red line, the production possibility frontier. We're assuming that it's going to produce on the production possibility frontier, not inside it. It's going to use its resources efficiently, and we're going to have efficient production techniques. So with a given technology, it'll be somewhere along this red line. We'll come back to that point in a moment. Likewise with Charnia, it will be producing on its production possibility frontier. But there we are, it can produce two goods, cloth and grain, in those particular combinations given what on the red line, the production possibility frontiers for both countries. So what about this question itself? If we had no trade between them, now we call that autarky, then they would settle on producing, let's say, producing and consuming halfway along the production possibility frontiers, a point we'll show in a minute. And then we'll show how both countries could increase their consumption of grain and cloth beyond autarky if they specialised in the good for which they had a comparative advantage and traded. And we'll explain what comparative advantage is in a moment. Okay, what about an answer? Well, what we're saying is that given the question we had, with autarky, Narnia produces 500 cloth units and 250 grain units. It's at point E, whereas Charn produces 250 cloth units and 500 grain units, point M. In other words, it's halfway along its production possibility frontiers. Both countries are. So I suppose the obvious question is, how could they improve on that? And what we're going to say is that if they specialise in what they were good at, that is in what they had a comparative advantage in, and then engaged in trade with each other, then they would be beneficial. How can we see that? Well, we need to look at what's called the opportunity cost ratios of both nations. The opportunity cost ratios represents if you produce one more of it, one unit, how much of the other unit do you forego? Okay, so if Narnia wanted to produce and consume one more grain unit, it would have to forego 2 cloth units, but only 0.5 of a grain unit if it wanted to produce and consume one more cloth unit. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's look at the Narnia and look at the line AB, which represents the production possibility frontier. We've already said that autarky, this country has chosen to produce at point E 500 cloth units and 250 grain units. That's a choice it's made. It hasn't engaged in trade with Charn. So what we want to look at is what's it costing it to produce an extra grain unit, or what's it costing it to produce an extra cloth unit? And if we started at A, if Narnia wanted to produce one more grain unit, then it would have to actually give up 2 cloth units. Now, how did I work that out? Well, quite simply, if we wanted to get rid of all our cloth units and produce just grain, you'd have to give up 1,000 cloth units to get 500 grain units. In other words, you have to give up twice as many cloth units in order to get grain. And therefore, the opportunity cost of one extra grain unit is 2 cloth units foregone. But if you went the other way, you went from B to A, then what you find is that in order to get 1 more cloth unit, you only give up half a grain unit to get that extra cloth unit. So clearly, Narnia is more efficient at producing cloth. It has a comparative advantage in producing cloth, is what we say. On the other hand, if we looked at Charn, then what would happen with Charn is if, again, we're on its production possibility frontier between X and Y, and they've chosen with autarky to be at point M, producing and consuming 250 cloth units and 500 grain units. That's just a choice they've made, depending on a whole range of factors in their own country. But if we wanted to, say, look at the how if they wanted to move from point X to point Y, that is, just produce 1 more grain unit, how much would it cost them? So if they wanted 1 more grain unit, they'd only give up half a cloth unit. So, and you can see that again, if you give up all your cloth units and produce grain, for 1 extra grain unit, you'd only have to give up half as much in terms of cloth. 500 divided by 1,000, if you want to think about it like that. Alternatively, they went the other way, went from Y to X, and they wanted to produce 1 more cloth unit, then effectively they give up 2 grain units for every extra cloth unit that they wanted to produce. Now, clearly for this country, it's very expensive. For Charn, it's very expensive to produce grain. It doesn't want to give up grain because that's what it's good at. It can produce more grain in this particular sense. So Charn has a comparative advantage in producing grain. It's more efficient in producing grain. So can we get any benefits? And the answer to that is, well, yes, we could. If each country could specialise in what they're good at, in which they had a comparative advantage, then they would actually increase their consumption of grain and cloth beyond autarky. In other words, beyond E and beyond M. So how would they do that? They would engage in some form of specialisation based upon the comparative advantage. In this case, we have what's called complete specialisation. It pay Narnia to actually produce at point A, okay, and then engage in some form of trade with Charn, because Charn would produce just grain. So specialisation involves Narnia producing at point A, i.e. producing only cloth, and Charn producing at Y and producing only grain. And then they have to find an exchange rate that would lead them to being better off. And that particular exchange rate must lie between the opportunity cost ratios. Let's say, for example, that they had an exchange rate of 1 cloth unit for 1 grain unit. Now that would make them both better off. Okay, and indeed, as I said, they're always better off if they are using an exchange rate between their opportunity cost ratios. So, and if you think about it, an exchange rate of 1 cloth for 1 grain unit is going to be better than could be achieved under autarky, given their own domestic opportunity cost ratios. And just think about what that means, because if we look, let's take Narnia. If it was at point A, if it wanted to get more grain and it only could go to point B. Remember, it had to give up 2 cloth units to get 1 extra grain unit. But if it could trade at 1 for 1 with Narnia, with Charn, if Narnia could trade with Charn on a 1 for 1 basis, it would be better off. Likewise, Charn would be better off if it specialised in producing Y and traded on a 1 for 1 basis with Narnia. Why? Because if you looked at what the pre-trade situation was, if it wanted to go from Y to X, it had to give up 2 grain units to get 1 cloth unit. Now, if it trades on a 1 for 1, it only has to give up 1 cloth unit. So 1 grain unit to get 1 cloth unit. That's much better than 2 grain units that it has to give up before trade. And it's the same with Narnia. If it before trade, it went from A to B, it was giving up 2 cloth units for 1 grain unit. Now, if it can engage in 1 for 1 trade with Charn, it would get, for every 1 extra grain unit it wants, it only have to give up 1 cloth unit, not 2. So clearly, if they can specialise in what they're good at and trade, they would have a new set of consumption possibility frontiers. And that's what I've shown. So in other words, a one-for-one trade would mean that, in this case, Narnia could trade all of its cloth, okay, go from A, right, trade all of its cloth, 1,000 units of cloth, and get 1,000 units of grain. Likewise, Charn, if it specialised in grain, could get obviously 1,000 units of grain, but if it traded all of those grain units just for cloth, it could get 1,000 cloth units. So what you would find is that the consumption possibility frontiers have increased for both Narnia and Charn. Remember that AB represented production possibilities and consumption possibilities, whereas AC for Narnia represents just consumption possibilities. It's going to specialise in what it's good at and then trade with Charn. And what you get with XY is that's the production and consumption possibility before trade for Charn. But when it engages in trade, its consumption possibilities are ZY, trading on a one-for-one basis. So what we'll immediately can see is that both countries could be better off. So how can we deal with that? Well, if we have a one-for-one exchange rate, and let's say Narnia exported 300 cloth units and imported 300 grain units from Charn, then both would actually be better off than they would be under autarky. So in other words, Narnia would start at point A, producing 1,000 cloth units and no grain units, and then it would export cloth to Charn to get grain, and let's say it exported 300 units, so it would go from producing and consuming 1,000 units of cloth to producing 700 units of cloth and consuming 700 units of cloth. But because it's engaged in one-for-one trade, it's imported 300 grain units. It's exported 300 cloth units and it's imported 300 grain units. It's moved from A to F, and immediately you can see that that's better than E for Narnia. And one could make the same case for Charn, because they're obviously trading 300 for 300. Then they started at point Y and exported 300 grain units in return for importing 300 cloth units from Narnia. They're at point N. So both countries are immediately better off. N is better than M. You're consuming more of both goods, both cloth and grain, if you're Charn or if you're Narnia. So trade has improved the welfare of both countries' citizens. The new consumption possibility for Narnia is at point F, and for Charn it is point N. And of course, if you look at it, when you compare the autarky state with the trade state, when the countries have found an appropriate exchange rate, specialised in what they're good at and found an appropriate exchange rate, you can see that the shaded area represents all the welfare improving opportunities that exist for both countries relative to the autarky position. Okay, well, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much.